السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والعاقبة للمتقين، ولا عدوان إلا على الظالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد وآله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم انفعنا بما علمتنا وعلمنا ما ينفعنا وزدنا علما وفقها في الدين يا رب العالمين. القدس لنا والأرض لنا، والله بقوته معنا، وجميع الكفر لو اجتمعت كي تهزمنا لن تهزمنا. Alhamdulillah, last week we covered a portion of the history of the land of Palestine, and inshallah this week we will continue. Before we continue, we'll just go through a quick recap, inshallah ta'ala. It is difficult to talk about the history without mentioning and having a glimpse at what our brothers and sisters in Palestine are going through at this moment in time. Last week, just before we came, or just before, a few hours before we had the first session, the news reached with regards to the power cuts and the cut-off of telecommunications. And today, just a few hours ago, we have the news of the hospitals being bombed, 3 hospitals, the hospital of Al-Shifa and the hospital of Al-Quds and the Indonesian hospital, as well as a convoy of ambulances which had been agreed with the Red Cross to go to the south of Gaza. All of them have been bombed. And another devastating attack on our brothers and sisters. We ask that Allah Azza wa Jal alleviate their suffering, and Allah Azza wa Jal grant them victory and peace. Khair. So without further ado, we'll just have a quick recap inshallah ta'ala. So we said that the course will cover 4 different areas. The first area is the geography and the geographical location of Palestine, which we went through last week. Thereafter we'll be covering the period before Islam. So before the coming of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the first inhabitants, when Masjid al-Aqsa was established, etc. All of these things until the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Thereafter we'll go through the period of the rule of Islam, from the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu until 1922. Thereafter we will cover the modern period, so the last century. So these are the 4 sections that we are aiming to cover inshallah ta'ala. Last week we covered the geographical location, we covered before Islam, and we started and we discussed the first period, the initial period of the Islamic rule in Palestine up until the Third Crusade. So this is where we reached last week. Inshallah this week we will go from the Third Crusade all the way until 1922 and towards the end of the Uthmani Khilafah. So this is the period we'll go on. Inshallah next week we'll cover the last section, which is the modern day conflict and everything that's happened, because it requires a lot of detail and so it will take more time. So inshallah that we will cover next week. So just a quick recap. So with regards to the geography of the land of Palestine, quick recap: to the north is Lebanon, to the north east of Palestine is Syria. Thereafter the rest of the east going all the way down is Jordan, which has the largest border with the land of Palestine. And thereafter on the south west you have Egypt. And we mentioned the West Bank is towards the east of Palestine, and it's called the West Bank because it's on the west of it's on the western bank of the Jordanian River. And then we pointed out the Dead Sea, the Red Sea towards the south. The Sinai Desert is the border of Egypt, just inside Egypt, which is where Gaza is located towards the west of Palestine. So this was the main areas which we covered last week without going into too much detail this week. But again, the geography of the location is important for us to understand the events that took place when and where. Thereafter, we went through the period before Islam. So we called it ancient history, or whatever we want to call it. So we went through the establishment of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa as being described by the Prophet ﷺ in the hadith. It was built by Adam alayhi salam 40 years after the establishment of the Kaaba. Thereafter, we talked about the first ruins that have been found in Jerusalem 10,000 years before Isa alayhi salam, so 12,000 years before now, in the city of Jericho. We had a picture as well last week. Thereafter, we went through the different stages of the local people living there, residing there. Thereafter, the people from Canaan who came from the Levant, so Syria, Lebanon area, they came down towards Jerusalem. They established themselves and the rule inside Jerusalem 3,000 years before Isa alayhi salam. Thereafter, we talked about the birth of Ibrahim alayhi salam in the year 2000, how he done hijrah and established himself in the land of Palestine in Jerusalem, and Lut alayhi salam also. And the people of Lut alayhi salam, we all know, in the location of the Dead Sea, where the punishment of Allah Azza wa Jal came upon them for the actions that they did. Thereafter, we covered the years 1500 before Isa alayhi salam, 1000, etc. So in these areas we covered how different rules came and went. So the Greeks came, we had Alexander the Great who came and went, we had the Persians, etc. All of these things were happening before Isa alayhi salam. And then Isa alayhi salam is born, and in the year that Isa alayhi salam is born, the area is mainly ruled by the offspring of Musa, or the offspring of Banu Israel at that time. So we went through the first establishment of Banu Israel at the time of Musa alayhi salam. So Musa alayhi salam, when he took them from, so they were residing in Egypt, and Musa alayhi salam was taking them towards Palestine when they were escaping from Fir'aun. And at that time, the people who were ruling in Palestine were the people of Canaan. Thereafter, Allah Azza wa Jalla ordered them to fight. They didn't fight, etc. Eventually, the rule was established of Banu Israel in Palestine with Dawood alayhi salam. We talked about the army of Talut and the army of Jalut. Jalut was from the people there, from the Philistines who were there, and the Canaans were ruling. So thereafter, that was the start and the establishment of the rule of Banu Israel in Palestine. Dawood alayhi salam. Thereafter, Dawood alayhi salam rules for 40 years, Sulaiman alayhi salam 40 years, thereafter 10 years until the kingdom splits. And we talked about the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, etc. Thereafter, the kingdoms break away with the invasions coming in from the east, the Assyrians first, thereafter from Babel. And we then went further on until after Isa alayhi salam, how the Persians would come in, allied with the Jews because they were being persecuted by the Romans. The Romans accepted Islam. The Romans, they accepted Christianity, and they persecute the Jews as a policy of the Byzantine Empire. And this went on until the conquest of Jerusalem and Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa by Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah radiyallahu an and Khalid ibn al-Walid radiyallahu an during the period of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu anhum ajma'in. And this was obviously during the reign of Umar al-Khattab radiyallahu anhu. Thereafter, in the 17th year of Hijrah. And then after that, we talked about the rule, the golden rule of Islamic history, the Umayyads, etc., until we have the first Crusades, when the Fatimiyyin had taken over Egypt and parts of Syria, and they started oppressing the Sunni Muslims as well as the Jews and the Christians and whoever else was residing there, which then instigated the first Crusade. The Crusaders came, they took over the land of Palestine for approximately 90 years until it was eventually taken back by by Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. And first, before that, we discussed Nuruddin al-Zinki, how he established the stronghold of the Muslims in the land of Ash-Sham, drove out the Crusaders from the main cities of Hims Aleppo, Halab, etc., which led to the Second Crusade. Thereafter Salahuddin al-Ayyubi takes over Al-Masjid al-Aqsa, which leads us to the Third Crusade, which is where we stopped last week. So inshallah, this was a brief summary of what we covered last week, inshallah. So these were the last 3 points which we mentioned. Salahuddin Nuruddin al-Zinki, the conquest of liberation of Aleppo, thereafter the Second Crusade, and thereafter the liberation of Jerusalem by Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. Obviously, once Salahuddin al-Ayyubi takes over, this does not mean that the Europeans and the Christians have lost complete hope or interest in Al-Masjid al-Aqsa or in the land of Jerusalem and Bethlehem, which for them is significance as the birthplace of Isa alayhi salam, etc. So they are not going to sit back and let the Muslims rule. So we have, after the liberation of Jerusalem by Salahuddin al-Ayyubi in the year 583 after Hijrah, we have another crusade. So we have the Third Crusade, and we'll go through these 7 crusades that took place. Yeah? So we covered 2 last week. We'll cover the following crusades today, inshallah. So we have the Third Crusade. The Third Crusade starts in 1189 and it lasts for a number of years until 1192. Now you'll see that a lot of the crusades, they last a number of years. So somebody might ask, why is it lasting so long? Especially when you go and see some of the outcomes, for example. The outcomes were not much. There was not a large amount of fighting or war in a number of crusades. So the question is asked, why did it take so long? Obviously, it requires preparation. So the armies prepare themselves. It takes them months to prepare. Thereafter, they have to journey either on horseback or in ships many of the time, because they were coming from Europe, including from England. So obviously the journey takes time. Thereafter, the battles take time, and thereafter they return back. So that's why the crusades, you'll find, they take a number of years, even if the actual fighting is not very lengthy. So we have King Richard of the First of England, we have King Frederick the First of Germany, and we have King Philip II of France. So they made an alliance to come and attack the Muslims and take back Jerusalem for the Christians. So this was the Third Crusade. Now Richard is famous in England. For those of us who have studied history in the UK, Richard is known as Richard the Lionheart. Khair. So they go. Now the crusade from the start, it is a bit of a shambles. They don't have unity between them. So these 3 kings, Germany, France and England, they are not completely united. On the way, the king of Germany, he drowns. So the German army is destroyed even before they reach Jerusalem. So now you're left with 2 armies, King Philip of France and King Richard of England. But then they have a fallout, and so King Philip returns with his armies back to France to plot against King Richard to get his wealth. And so Richard is left by himself to fight against and take back Jerusalem for the Christians in this crusade. Anyway, he goes, they have back and forth, they have a number of battles, etc. with Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. So Salahuddin al-Ayyubi is still there, he is the ruler. So they have some back and forth, the Ayyubid dynasty is there, Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. Eventually, they come to a peace agreement. Salahuddin al-Ayyubi gives them a bit of autonomy in the area of Jaffa, which is basically like a port town. They are able to come in, they're able to use Al-Masjid al-Aqsa, go to Bethlehem, to their churches, etc. And they are given free passage and peace, and they're able to come and visit peacefully and do their pilgrimages, etc. So this is the agreement that takes place. However, Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, he passes away. He passes away approximately, he passes away the following year. So we have here until 1192. Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, rahimahullah, he passes away in the 3rd of March, 1193. So approximately 6 months after the agreement. So we have the agreement with King Richard. Salahuddin al-Ayyubi passed away 6 months after the agreement is made. Once he passes away, those who follow him from the Ayyubid dynasty, they're not as charismatic leaders, as forceful or as good leaders as he was. And therefore they give a bit more, or they concede a bit more of the administration of Jerusalem to the Christians. So they concede some of the administration of Jerusalem to the Christians. So you could say that the de facto administration of the city of Jerusalem and Bethlehem, with a corridor to the sea for them to travel, was under the administration of the Christians. Was under the administration of the Christians. And the Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa and the Muslims locally, their jurisdiction was their own courts, etc. So Masjid Al-Aqsa and the Muslims there had their own courts and their own jurisdiction, but the general administration of the city was given to the Christians as well as Bethlehem. So just two towns. Then in the year 1202, so not that long later, we have the Pope Innocent III. He's called Innocent, but khair. So he's also encouraging all of the Christians in Europe to come and take back the land of Jerusalem. Safe passage is not enough for them. They don't want to have just a safe passage and ability to come and do and visit Bethlehem and Jerusalem. So he manages to encourage the King of France, and they start their journey towards Jerusalem. On the way, they stop in what is now known as Croatia. On the way, so they stop in Croatia. Now in Croatia, they find a man, and this man is Prince Alexius, the son of Isaac. And he says that I am in fact the true heir to the throne of the Byzantine or the Eastern Roman Empire. And my dad Isaac, he's supposed to be the king. But we've been banished from the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. So if you get my father back onto the throne, I promise you a lot of wealth and a lot of gold. So he promises them lots of riches. So what they do is they change path because they see gold. So they go and they take Prince Alexius and his father Isaac, and they go and fight against the Byzantine Empire and the emperor who's currently sitting on the throne in what is nowadays Istanbul, but was then Constantinople. And eventually they overthrow the Byzantine emperor, and they put Isaac on the throne and the leader of the Roman Empire. Once he's on the throne, he gives a lot of gold and treasures to the Crusaders and the French king, and so they are happy with the gold that they have got. They're not interested in Jerusalem, and so they return back without even going to fight or even attempt to invade Al-Quds. So this is the end of the Fourth Crusade. Thereafter you have the next crusade, which was one of the worst atrocities that took place in this country and in Europe. It was called the Children's Crusade. So what they did was they gathered and they encouraged the priests, the Christian priests, they encouraged children and promised them not only gold, etc. in this world, but promised them ultimate salvation and after death. And the ages that they were aiming and targeting, or which from the age of 10 to 18, from the age of 10 to 18, and they gathered 30,000 children, 30,000 young people from the age of 10 to 18. And the plan was, this was the army that was going to Jerusalem to take back and give it back to the Christians. On the way, obviously they went in ships. On the way the ships drowned. So a lot of these children, they all drowned. And those who survived, the captains of the ships had ulterior motives. They took them all as slaves. So they were taken and sold in the slave markets. So this was a big catastrophe that took place at that time. Thereafter we have the Fifth Crusade. So as you can see, it doesn't stop, it continues. So we have the Fifth Crusade. The Fifth Crusade was in the year 610 Hijri, which was from the year 1216 to the year 1221. So now we have Andrew II of Hungary. So you can see it's different countries, it's all the Christian fiefdoms in Europe. So we have Andrew II of Hungary, Leopold VI of Austria, and we have them joining forces to come and take over Jerusalem. Now we have obviously the Ayyubid dynasty, which was then succeeded by the Mamluks. So the Mamluks are now ruling, and they are ruling Palestine. But the seat of power is in Egypt. The seat of power is in Egypt, just like the Ayyubids were, because they succeeded them. So they succeeded the seat of power in Egypt. So the Mamluks are in Egypt. So what they decide is, for the king of Hungary, etc., they decide that they will attack the Muslims in Egypt first. They will attack the Muslims in Egypt. If they are able to overpower and overthrow the rulers of the Mamluks in Egypt, then they've taken over and conquered the Muslim rule and the Muslim force. And if they've taken over the main seat, the main power, then Jerusalem will be a piece of cake and really easy. So they come and they attack in Egypt. And initially you have Malik al-Kamil. He's the son of the Sultan of the Mamluks. So Malik al-Kamil. And he was very significant. He was the one who was leading the army. So the son of the Sultan, he was leading the army in the battlefield. And he fought against the Crusaders. And he pushed them back for a long time. But they continued to press until they reached near the river Nile. So they pushed his army back a bit. But when they reached the river Nile, by the will of Allah Azza wa Jal, flooded. So they weren't able to cross. And then behind them they had crossed the canal. The canal behind them also flooded. So now they were blocked. In front of them is the river Nile, flooded. Behind them the canal, flooded. They can't go forward, they can't retreat. And this is when the forces of Malik al-Kamil come and they crush the Fifth Crusade. And in fact, some of them are taken prisoner, etc. And again, a treaty is drawn up where they are allowed to come peacefully and visit their places in Jerusalem and in Bethlehem, but not as an invading force. Thereafter, you have the Sixth Crusade. In the Sixth Crusade, you have a Roman Empire. So you have the Roman Emperor Frederick II, and that's in 1228, 1229. So it's not a long period. It was just a year, just over a year. And he comes to attack the Mamluks. At that time, the Mamluks came a bit weak, so again they conceded to him Jerusalem and Bethlehem, like we said before. So the Romans, the Christians, they had administration over Jerusalem and Bethlehem with the route towards the sea. Again, and the Muslims had al-Masjid al-Aqsa and their own courts amongst themselves. This lasted for a number of years until the year 1244. So in the year 1244, now at that time the Mamluks were getting weak. The Mamluks in Egypt, they were getting weak. So we have the Khawarizm. So the Khawarizmi, they come and they take over and they come all the way to Jerusalem and they ransack Jerusalem. And they destroy they destroy many homes, etc. And the Muslims, they take over Jerusalem and the Christians are expelled from Jerusalem. So they held administrative power in Jerusalem for a few years, from the Sixth Crusade until the year 44. Now the Mamluks are now coming to an end, and when you look at the pictures of Al-Masjid al-Aqsa, you have in the courtyard outside, you have those steps with those arches. I'm sure everyone would have seen the pictures. These arches were built by the Mamluks. They were built by the Mamluks. So this is a part of the architecture and a sign of the Mamluks, which is still remaining until today. Thereafter we have the final crusade, which was the Seventh Crusade, and this was in the year 1248 to 1254. So it was quite a long crusade, and this was again from King Louis the Ninth of France, and he came and attacked. Again, it was the same thing. The stronghold of the Muslims was in Egypt, and again we still had the Mamluks. We have Turan Shah, who was the Sultan of the Mamluks in Egypt. And so King Louis, he comes again to Egypt, overthrow the Sultan in Egypt. He can get easy access to Jerusalem. It's the same tactic being repeated. There the fighting goes on for a while. Eventually he is taken prisoner by Turan Shah. So he is imprisoned, and then eventually he is released, and they come again to an agreement that the Christians can have safe passage and do their worship, but without attacking. After this, the Christians don't pay much attention to Jerusalem and Al-Masjid al-Aqsa. They have internal troubles in Europe, etc. And there's not much of a crusade or much encouragement of the kings in Europe or by the Pope or by the priests, etc. to come and take over the land of Palestine. And they have a little interest, but not much, until the year 1492. in the year 1492, their interest in Palestine completely comes to an end. After 1492, there is no Christian interest in Palestine in terms of religious interest. European interest comes much later on, which we'll find out, but that has nothing to do with Christianity as in the Christendom. So the Christians, they lose all interest in 1492 because Christopher Columbus has discovered America, which was already discovered by other people before, by the Vikings, for example, and Muslims. But Christopher Columbus discovers America, and so now they have new areas to look for gold, and that's when they go and they pillage America. They harm the natives who are living there, etc. But that's a different story. So the interest of the Christians and the Crusades completely ends in the year 1492. So this is the end of all the Crusades. So remember, in this period we have the who's ruling in Egypt and Palestine. We have the Mamluks. Thereafter we have the Mongol, then the Mongols' invasion. So we have the famous Genghis Khan. So Genghis Khan, he starts in 1214. So he starts in 1214. So 611 after Hijrah. So 800 years ago, approximately. He starts, he crosses the Great Wall of China. He crosses the Great Wall of China and he starts coming towards the west from China, taking over lands in front of him. He takes over Beijing first, he becomes the Emperor of China. Thereafter he continues towards the west. And as he goes through over the few years, he takes over a large part of land until he takes through and he conquers Persia. So when we talk about Persia, we're talking about modern day Iran, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Samarkand, Bukhara, the place of Imam Bukhari, Imam Muslim, all of these areas. He takes over all of these areas and he comes towards, so he completely takes over the whole Persian Empire. And the whole of there was no Persian Empire, but he takes over Persia. And these areas were obviously ruled by Muslims. It was all part of the Muslim Empire. But this was a time when the Muslim Empire was very weak. It was probably one of the weakest that we can see in the whole of history, in the whole of the history of Islam, until the last 100 years. So he comes in 1227, he dies, his successor takes over, and his successor then furthers his conquests. So he goes north. He doesn't come down south, he goes north, and he takes over parts of Russia and starts entering into Europe. He goes further east also and goes all the way to the far east. So now you can see they're expanding there. The Mongols were the fastest expanding empire that is ever on record in history. They expanded very quickly. So you can see from 1214 he starts, and by the year 1227 he's taken over Russia, all the way from east of China. So they take over large parts of land. Then we have one of the saddest and most devastating incidents that occur in the history of Islam. So in the year 1258 is when they enter into Iraq and they take over Baghdad. And it was known as the sacking of Baghdad. This was a very devastating incident that took place. When you go through the history of Islam, you'll find that at that time the Muslims were not turning towards Allah Azza wa Jal. People had left the Sunnah of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and there was a lot of corruption in the Muslim world, in the Muslim society. People were disobeying Allah Azza wa Jal. There were a lot of disobedience was rife, etc. Without going into too much detail, and people had focused on worldly matters and worldly issues. Obviously there was still ulama, etc. there, but they were a minority as compared to what the situation of the majority and especially the leaders of the Muslim Empire was. And so they come and they ransack Baghdad, and this was the end of the Khilafah al-Abbasiyya, the end of the Abbasid Khilafah. So you have the Umayyads who had their headquarters in Dimashq in Sham. Thereafter you have the Abbasids who are in Baghdad, and the Mongols, they destroyed and ended the Abbasid Khilafah. And when they came in, they absolutely ransacked Baghdad. Baghdad had one of the largest libraries in the world, if not the largest library in the world. The books from this library were thrown into the river. That the historians of the time say that the color of the river turned black with the amount of ink that had been washed off the pages of the books from the Muslim libraries. And the leaders of the Abbasid Khilafah, they were wrapped up in rugs and trodden and trampled upon to death by the horses of the invading Mongols. And this is how they met their end. Thereafter, in fact, the stories that come from there are even more heart-wrenching. You will have one female soldier killing 40 of the Muslims because they would not stand up in front of the Mongols. So this was the sacking of the Baghdad, which was a very significant event that took place. And at this point, the Muslim world was at its lowest point. Imagine the Khilafah has basically broken down. There's no Khalif. Before that, the whole Muslim world, despite all of the different dynasties and places in Spain and Egypt and everywhere else, they were still bound by the Khalifa. They were still all bound together by the Khalifa. And they were all subjected to Khalifa even if they had autonomous rule in their areas. However, at this point, large parts of the Muslim empire have been ransacked, been taken by the Mongols. The Khilafah is now collapsed, and you have a few Muslim states here and there. And the fear in the world is that this Mongol army has never been defeated. It's never been defeated. It was never defeated in battle until this point. And the fear amongst all of the Muslims was, and in fact even the Western world, because they had started coming into Eastern Europe, was that the Mongols are going to take over the whole world, the entire world. So we have them now coming into Ash-Sham. They take over Ash-Sham, they take over large parts of Syria. And then they're turning and they're looking towards Jerusalem, which is still under there's an agreement now between the Christians and the Muslims in Jerusalem. The Christians are given de facto rule in Jerusalem, the administrative duties, and the Muslims are the armies defending the borders of Jerusalem. Yeah. So the Muslims are doing the army, but they've given the de facto administrative duties to the Christians who are residing there. They had an agreement and a treaty with the Christians of Europe at that time because of the onslaught of the Mongols. So we have in 1260 we have a decisive battle. In 1260 we have a decisive battle, and this is as important as the battle of Salahuddin al-Ayyubi in the battle of Hittin against the Crusades. And in fact, some of the Mu'arrikhun and some of the Muslim historians say that this battle was even more pivotal than the one of Salahuddin, because this was in the face and the wake of an army which had never been defeated, and an army which was so powerful that nobody would want to even stand in front of the army. Many times, once they started expanding, armies would just run away. They would not even want to face them in the battlefield. And in Egypt, the Mamluks, they weren't very strong. They just had Egypt and Palestine, that's it. They weren't a very large force. And the numbers, if you look history, the numbers between the army of the Mamluks and the army of the Mongols, the difference is huge. A massive difference in numbers. But again, as we know, Allah Azza wa Jalla says in the Quran that كَم مِّن فِئَةٍ قَلِيلَةٍ غَلَبَتْ فِئَةً كَثِيرَةً بِإِذْنِ اللَّهِ. That how many times does Allah Azza wa Jalla make a small, true group of believers and a small group of fighters overcome and overpower a much larger group. And we see this throughout the whole history. Majority of the battles in the history at the time of the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, and throughout history, the Muslims were in a smaller number. So he starts looking towards Palestine. At this time we have the leader of the Mamluks, we have Sayfuddin Qutuz. You have Sayfuddin Qutuz. And when he receives in his court 14 messengers from Halaku Khan, who is the leader of the Mongols at that time. And when he receives these messengers, they threaten him. They tell him, either you surrender right now, or we're going to kill every single one of you. This is what he is told. So what does he do? He says, you're going to kill every single one of us? Okay, I'll kill every single one of you. He kills all 14 of those messengers. Then he gets their heads and he displays them and he sends this message back to Halaku Khan, you can never come into this land. And this was an amazing thing, because nobody could stand in front of the Mongols. Nobody could stand in front of the Mongols. Eventually we have the battle of Ain Jalut. And in the battle of Ain Jalut we have Ruknuddin, Baybars, and the Sultan of the Mamluks, Saifuddin Qutuz. And they plot, they devise a plan, a military plan to fight against the Mongols. And they go through from Gaza. And just after Gaza, just north of Gaza, is where the battle of Ain Jalut takes place, just north of Gaza. And eventually in this battle, the Mongols are defeated. And this was the first major defeat of the Mongols. In fact, this one single battle stopped and stunned the advancement of the Mongols. After this battle, the Mongols did not take over any more land. They did not advance anymore. In fact, this was the beginning of their collapse. And after this, they retreated. They were pushed back through Sham. They were pushed back through Syria, pushed back through Iraq, until eventually they were defeated and they ceased to exist. So this battle of Ain Jalut was a very significant battle that took place in the land of Palestine, and the land of Palestine returned back to the Muslims at the hands of, through the will of Allah Azza wa Jal, at the hands of Saifuddin Qutuz and Ruknuddin Baybars. Anyway, it is maybe advisable that you can go back and read upon the history of what happened at this time. After that, without going into the rest of the history, let's just quickly have a snapshot of what's happening in Europe at this time. Yeah? Because remember, the Jews, they had spread all around the world because they had been exiled by the Christians for many years, and so they had escaped into Europe. They had access to the west, to the east, to different places. Yes, when the Muslims came back, they came back and settled, but again there were always wars. The Christians were, the Crusades came for 100 years and more, etc. So there were battles going on in the area, and they weren't really aligned to anybody, and so they would move, come back, etc. So they were not only in the east, in the Muslim lands, but we also had Jews in the Christian lands. As we said, in the Muslim lands, the Jews were living in peace. There was no persecution of the Jews, etc. They were allowed to worship and live wherever they were living in the Muslim lands, including Palestine. In Europe, however, the story was different. So if you look, we covered until 1260. So we'll just quickly go through the history of the Jews in Europe when they had gone to the west. So we have, for example, the different countries. We have Spain. Now in Spain we had Muslim rule. While the Muslim rule was in Spain, the Jews were living a very prosperous life. They had all the rights that they would have as citizens of the Muslim Empire. They had businesses, they had homes, they were prosperous. However, at the end of the rule of Spain and the collapse of the Islamic rule in Spain in 1226, and the Christians come in. When they came in, then they persecuted not only the Muslims, they also persecuted the Jews. And remember, we mentioned this last week as well, that according to the Christians, the Jews were the largest criminals for them, because they regarded the Jews as the ones who killed Isa alayhi salam. And therefore, the killers of their prophet, or the killers of what they believe, it was their largest enemy. And so they persecuted them wherever they went. And we'll see this being replicated. So we have in Spain, as after the Muslim rule ends, the Christians come in, they force all Jews to wear badges, a sign that I am a Jew. Then we have, and this continues, they are persecuted in Spain for a couple of 100 years until eventually 1478. The Jews are persecuted to an extent, 20,000 of them are killed. They're completely just slaughtered, and 160,000 Jews. So imagine how many Jews were living under Muslim rule in Spain, in peace, in prosperity. When the Christians came in first, they made them wear badges, identify as Jews, and they became third-class citizens. They were oppressed. But eventually, 200 years later, they slaughtered them. 20,000 Jews were killed, and 160,000 Jews were expelled from the land of Spain, just the land of Spain. We're not even talking about Portugal. That's in Spain. Then we have England. In 1190 in England, we have a famous incident where all the Jews were incarcerated in York in the north. They were incarcerated, and they did not want to be killed or tortured by their Christian tormentors, and so there was a mass suicide. They all killed themselves so that they did not have to face the murder and torture, and possible torture which would be worse than instant death at the hands of the Christians in York. And again the same thing, they were expected to wear badges, and then in 1290 they were expelled from England as a whole. So they were expelled from even England as a whole in 1290. Then you have France, and the reason why we're mentioning these countries is because they're important. These are the countries who are now supporting, the British supporters. So in 1394, again the same thing, France expelled all Jews. They expelled all Jews from France. Jews were not allowed to reside in France. If a Jew was found, he'd either be killed or imprisoned. Then we have Poland. In Poland in 1648, we find that the Jews who are living there, they are banned from crafts, they're banned from farming, they're banned from commercial interests, they're not allowed to have businesses, etc. So they become very poor, they're only allowed to do things which they can't go through education, etc. They live a very low life, worse than third-class citizens in the country of Poland. Then we have Portugal, Italy, all of these countries, the Jews are completely expelled. They're not allowed to reside in any of these countries. So we can see how the Jews, even in Europe, under the Christian rule in those times, they're being persecuted. Everywhere they go, every country they're in, they're being persecuted. The places where they are finding refuge, etc., at that time were in the Muslim lands, where they were finding peace, they were finding their rights, they were finding prosperity. Then we have a change in Europe. So we say, okay, there's loads of Jews in Europe now, where did they come from? If they were all expelled then, when did they come back? So we have 1789. And this is a very important date in history, because a lot of things change and there's a lot of impact on our world status quo and how things are today. But what took place in 1789, the French Revolution. And you can read about the French Revolution separately, but it's a very significant event that took place in the history of the world, the French Revolution, especially in Europe, but the impact was worldwide. Until today, a lot of things and impacts that we see come from the French Revolution. Anyway, so they have the French Revolution in 1789, rebellion against the church, etc. So this is the diminishing of Christian rule and Christian impact on Western society. So you could say this is the start of secularism and liberalism. In 1789, the French Revolution. So after the French Revolution takes place, then you have in France Napoleon, famous Napoleon, and in England you have the famous Oliver Cromwell. They bring in laws. So Oliver Cromwell brings in laws. So now the church has been diminished. It's a side thing. Before the church was ruling, but now the church is on the side. You have now the governments, parliaments, etc. And so Oliver Cromwell brings in a rule and law allowing Jews to return back to Britain, back to England. Same thing in France. Napoleon introduces laws allowing the Jews now to come and reside again in France. And so generally Western Europe, slowly after the French Revolution, the laws start relaxing and Jews start to return. However, this is only in Western Europe. We have Eastern Europe. So for example, in 1796, we have again a great oppression of the Jews takes place. And this was called the pogroms. So what happened in this ones, we have Poland and Russia. Russia invades Poland. Poland has the economy dissolves, crashes, collapses, there's impact on society, etc. And Russia withdraws, etc. However, the Jews are blamed. And so there's a big purge of Jews in Russia and in Poland and in Eastern Europe. And this continues all the way until the First World War. So you have, for example, at that time, escaping from Russia, more than 2 million Jews. They've got an exact number. If you look in the history books, there's an exact number. 2,366,941. That's how many Jews escaped from the Russian confederates and Poland at that time. However, only 2.3%, 55,000, sought refuge in Palestine. The others went to other countries in different places. Then we have Tsar Nicholas II, for those who know the history of World War I. Again, before the World War, he persecuted. There was a huge economic collapse and problems in Russia. Who did he blame? The Jews. He blamed the Jews. So again, he did a big purge of the Jews, killing Jews, arresting them, torturing them, oppressing them, etc. So this is what they were facing in Eastern Europe, but the laws in Western Europe had sort of relaxed. Then you have in 1890, so not long ago, we have them, because of their persecution in all of these countries, the Jews, they migrate, as we said. Now the Jews, they migrated to a number of countries, and if you look, a lot of these countries are Muslim countries. So we have Morocco. That's why you might have seen these videos of Jews in Morocco, etc. So they migrated from Eastern Europe to Morocco. They migrated to Turkey. They migrated to South Africa. And so South Africa, there's a Mufti Sahib will know, there's a good community, a strong community of Jews. Then a lot of them, obviously, they moved to Canada. They went to America. A few of them, not large communities, but they went to Canada, they went to America as well at the time, and some of them went to Palestine. But it was only a small number who went to Palestine. It wasn't a large number of Jews going to Palestine at that time. That comes a bit later. So this was just an understanding of what was happening in Europe during this whole time after they were expelled from Jerusalem. Thereafter we have the Uthmani Khilafah and the Ottoman rule. So the Uthmani Khilafah is founded by Uthman in the year 1299. In the year 1453, and we have Uthman. He establishes the Uthmani Khilafah, and in the year 1453, Sultan Mahmud. So approximately 154 years later. So 150 years after the establishment of the Uthmani Khilafah, after Uthman established the Khilafah, is the conquest of Constantinople. So Sultan Mahmud al-Thani, the second, he takes over Constantinople, and that becomes, Qustantiniya becomes the seat of the Khilafah of the Uthmani Khilafah, the Uthmani rule. Thereafter we have, the rule continues again for another 70 years. And during this time, we have different dynasties. As we said, there were different dynasties, different rules, different kingdoms in the Muslim world. So they weren't all united in that sense, although they would swear allegiance to the Khalif, but not they weren't all of them directly ruled by the Khalifa. They would have autonomous rule, and some of them refused to pledge allegiance. So in the year 1517, we have battles taking place in Egypt and Jerusalem, because the local rulers there, they declined to do bay'ah and pledge allegiance to the Khalifa. And as in Islam, the whole Muslim Ummah has to be united as one. Somebody can't rebel against the Khalifa. He has to subjugate himself to the Khalifa. There can't be two Khalifas, there can only be one. And so they fight to keep autonomous rule in their area. They are defeated by the Ottoman Empire armies, and eventually in 1517, generally you can say majority of the Muslim world is consolidated. So the Jerusalem, so Palestine, Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, all the way until Mecca, Al-Madinah, so the whole Arab world comes under the rule of the Uthmani Khilafah and the Ottoman rule. So this is in the year 1517. So you can see it started 1300, 1517, so 218 years later. Thereafter, in the year 1520 to the year 1556, we have the peak of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is at its peak. Is ruled by Suleiman al-Qanuni, or Suleiman the Magnificent, as he's known in the West. and he is ruling the Uthmani Khilafah. The Uthmani Khilafah extends all the way from Russia and all the borders of China in the east, and stretches all the way to Italy, to Vienna, and to the south of France in the west. So you can see the expanse of the Uthmani Khilafah. It expands the whole world from the east borders of China all the way until south of France. And Sulaiman al-Qanuni, he has taken an expedition to Russia and to fight against the armies there, and that is where Sulaiman al-Qanuni passes away. But the people are not informed until they bring his body back to Istanbul, so that it doesn't cause problems within the Muslim Empire. Anyway, so this was a time of prosperity, etc., and we have again all the Jews living in the Muslim lands, in Palestine, in all the different areas, and again they're living a life of freedom and prosperity, and a lot of the Jews have come from Europe as well to reside in the Muslim lands. Thereafter, approximately 100 years after the demise of Sulaiman al-Qanuni, al-Khalifa, we have the start of the decline of the Uthmani Khilafah. The start of the decline of the Uthmani Khilafah. Now, it is a long time ago. It's in 1683. And there was one significant event. So if you remember, like the Mongols, their significant event that took place, the battle that took place, which was the start of their decline, was the battle of Ain Jalut. So in the same way, the start of the decline of the Uthmani Khilafah is said to be the Battle of Vienna. The Battle of Vienna. So in this battle, the forces of the Khalifa of the time were defeated. The forces were defeated, and according to the judgments of the historians, this was the start of the decline in terms of the expansion of the Uthmani Khilafah. But as I said, the decline was slow. So it wasn't even until much later, in 1830, that the French took over Algeria from the Ottomans. So you can see the time difference from 1683 all the way until 1830. So we have 150 years until they are able to take over Algeria, which is still within the Western Islamic world. So it's still the Western Islamic world. The French take over Algeria, which is obviously on the shores of the Mediterranean. So it's just across the sea, across the road for the French and the Italians. Now, how they used to rule, this is important. How the Uthmani Khilafah used to rule was, as we said before, imagine you have this whole expanse of land. It's not possible for the Khalif in Constantinople or Istanbul to rule and have direct control over every single area that is under his control. So how it would work is that in each of these areas there would be local governance. So for example, we have Al-Maghrib al-Islami. We have the Western Islamic hemisphere. So we have, for example, the countries of Morocco, modern-day Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, etc. These areas. So they will have autonomous rule, meaning they have local rule, local administration, and laws have been determined by the central government in Istanbul, in Constantinople, dictating how they should rule in their local area. But the local rule is for the local people that have been appointed by the Khalifa. So the Khalifa will appoint somebody locally to look after the local affairs, who reports back to the central government, but locally they have their own autonomous administration. They have their own autonomous administration, and they manage all their affairs without having to refer everything back to the central authority. So for example, in Palestine, it will be the same thing. The local, they'll have a local leader appointed by the Khalifa, and he will be in charge of Palestine, but he's local. And then he'll have his own local shura, his own local ministers, etc. in the different parts of Palestine, which the Khalifa will not be interfering with. Yeah? So he has a local rule in the area where he is administrating. And one of the rules that was brought about at that time was in 1858 was the Ottoman Land Code. And there's a discussion with regards to this land code from the Islamic point of view. Let's put it to a side, but in terms of the impact that this land code had on what took place afterwards with the British mandate in Palestine and the ownership of the land, etc. So this land code was basically that land which did not directly necessarily belong to an individual, or was not used for plowing, was not used for crops, etc. This land could be, under this land code, could be handed over or signed and put in the name of the government. So it will be put in de facto name of the government and those who rules. This was the Ottoman land code. The impact of this comes later on, when the claim is that when whoever comes into power therefore owns all of the land. Do you understand the issue? So the land does not belong to the locals, it belongs to the central government. So according to the Ottoman land code, any of these lands which are uncultivated, not really inhabited or used by anybody, and this is normal, like if you go outside towns, etc., you'll have land which doesn't belong to anybody, or land which is not necessarily cultivated. Living in this country is difficult to comprehend, because in this country everything is owned. In this country everything is owned. In England everything is owned. And this was a pattern which has been happening for hundreds of years, where it started where whoever the king would come, he'd give land to the barons and those who had supported him. And therefore, as England is an island, the land expanses are much, the population in terms of the land is high in terms of population density, and majority of the land, and the land is all fertile, and therefore all of the land is used for crop and cultivation and farming. And so whoever would become king and the ruler, he would give the people who supported him land. So he'd give the barons, he'd give them land. Then when there was a revolution and somebody else overthrew that king and he took power, then he'd take all the land and then he'd distribute to those who supported him. And this is how the cycle would go on in this country. That's why if you look now, the land belongs to, majority of the lands in this country belong to a handful of families. They belong to a handful of families, and they control most of the land up and down the country. And any land that doesn't seem to have an owner, by default it belongs to the crown. It belongs to the crown. Now, if you go into other countries, like even in Europe, etc., this is not the case. So you'll have a large swaths of land and areas which do not belong to anybody. They don't belong to an individual. It's not private land. It belongs to that country, but it doesn't belong as in ownership of the government. Yeah? So it's not individual land belonging to somebody. And you'll have this throughout other parts of Europe. You have in Asia, Africa, etc. For example, in some countries like in Gambia, if you cultivate the land, it belongs to you. It doesn't belong to anybody else before that. Yeah. So if you want land, just go and buy a tractor and go to Gambia. But there's other caveats as well. So this was the case. Even now with this code, with this land code, what happened was, you could the people in the administrative rule in Palestine, what they would do is, any land that is not cultivated, etc., you write it in the name of the Ottoman government, of the Ottoman rule. So that land belongs to the Ottomans. So when the British mandate comes in later on, any land that belongs to the Ottomans is signed over to the British, not to the local Palestinians. Do you understand why this was an issue? So now you have like, Musa alayhi salam, when he crossed and then the river from Fir'aun, and then he was told by Allah Azza wa Jal to command his people to go and fight against the people of Canaan, and they refused. And then Allah Azza wa Jal kept them in the emptiness, the wilderness. Yeah, and they couldn't escape. They couldn't go to Jerusalem. They couldn't go to Egypt. They were confined there. This area is known as the wilderness until today. And this area is not an area which is really a place of crop or cultivation, etc. Until today, there are nomadic Arabs living in this land. Bedouins, they live in this land. It's like a desert land, the wilderness, and they have absolutely no rights in the state of Israel. They have no rights there. They can't register themselves as working. They can't do anything. They're Muslim Arabs living in this area. But this area, the wilderness, basically because it wasn't private land for anybody, it's a large part of the south of Palestine. It was automatically came under the ownership of the British mandate. So this was this rule which is seen as modern historians as something which caused a problem for the local Palestinians there, but that's a discussion that can go back and forth and arguments on both sides. Khair. So thereafter we have towards the end of the decline of the Uthmani Khilafah, expansion of colonialism, we have the beginning of nationalism. And this nationalism which we have now, so we have nation states, etc. These never used to exist before, especially in the Muslim lands. And this is something which we need to understand. There was no concept of a nation state. They didn't used to have this is the state, this state, etc. No, they used to have local administrative areas, so that they would allow these tribes to locally administer themselves. But they were not a nation. They were not a nation. These tribes are there. The nation was all the Muslims. All the Muslims are one nation. You can't have a nation here that's this country or this country. This concept did not exist in the Eastern world. Outside of Europe, it never existed. It started becoming more prominent in Europe after the French Revolution. That's why I said the French Revolution had a massive change in how things happened in the world. So we have the seeds of nationalism are then planted in and they are exported to the East, exported to the Muslim lands. And so colonialism brings this into the Arab world to split, the divide and rule, divide and conquer. This is what they did everywhere they went. But they needed to break up the Uthmani Khilafah. They needed to break up the Ottoman rule. And so, for example, you have in 1871, you have the American University of Beirut, which is founded. Yeah? So we have the American University of Beirut. And a few years later, we have the first party, you can say political party, in the East, in the Muslim lands, calling for expulsion of Turks from Arab lands. Yeah? So we have, if the university is in 1871, they graduate in 1875, you have elites, Arab elites, calling for an Arab land. Why are Turks in the land of the Arabs? And these were the seeds of nationalism that were sown. And these universities, so the American University in Beirut was the first which was established, and then they built other places of education as well in the area. And what they would have is they would have the elite Arabs come and study inside these schools and these universities. So these are the people who are doing the administration for the Uthmani Khilafah. They are the elites. Their children go through these universities, and when they graduate from these universities, they have planted in them the seed of nationalism. And once they graduate, they now want a separate land for the Arabs. Why are these Turks ruling us? And this started first in the land of what we see now, so Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. They started there, and thereafter they spread into the blessed lands of Mecca and Medina, Al-Medina also, so the Arabian Peninsula. And they established this in all of these places and in other places as well around the world. So then in 1908, just before the First World War, we have what was called the Young Turk Revolution. The Young Turk Revolution. So as we said, in 1875, the first Arab nationalist political party is founded. Yeah? They then start having discussions with the Sultan Hamid al-Thani of the Uthmani Khilafah. We need to have some kind of autonomous rule, autonomy, etc., etc., until eventually he signs an agreement with them. He signs an agreement with them in order to placate them and keep them at peace. However, he sees that no, things are going in the wrong direction. So after 2 years, he breaks this agreement. He says this agreement has been nullified. In response to that, you have what was called the Young Turk Revolution. Now, in the Young Turk Revolution, those who were revolting against the Ottoman Khilafah, they're not Turks, they're Arabs. Yeah, they're Arabs. So in the Young Turk Revolution, there are these Arabs, the Arabs who want an Arab national state, etc., who are rebelling against the Ottoman Khilafah. And this is when eventually the Sultan has to concede to the Young Turks in this revolution, so that the Ottoman Khilafah isn't totally disbanded. And so what you have now is Jerusalem, Baghdad, Damascus, so Iraq, Palestine, Syria, all of these areas now have a representative that has been chosen by them in Istanbul. And this is different to what it used to be before, because initially what did we say? The local ruler or the local administrative official was appointed by the Khilafah, by the Khalifa. Now it's the opposite. The local people have a leader who then goes to Istanbul and sits there in the thing. So this was basically the start of basically the start of what was a democratic kind of rule in the Uthmani Khilafah, which led to its decline, which led to its collapse within a few years. Which led to its collapse in a few years because it was not possible for it to continue this way. This was one of the reasons for its collapse. So this was basically the start of democracy or democratic type of administration of all of these lands that were underneath the Uthmani Khilafah. Local representatives being placed in the parliament. As we have today, you have a local MP, he then represents you in parliament. So they used to have the local representatives in Istanbul. Khair, so these are all the incidents leading up to the British mandate in Palestine, and thereafter the signing over of the land of Palestine to the Zionist movement after World War I. Inshallah, all of these details we'll cover next week, inshallah ta'ala, as this is where the foundation of the state of Israel comes, and the few events that lead up to that, but they're all linked. So we'll stop here this week, inshallah ta'ala, and next week we'll cover the establishment of the state of Israel and then what has happened since then. If there are any questions or anything today, if anyone has any questions, ask questions. Any questions? No?
What was the religion of the Mongols?
The Mongols, they were polytheists. So they used to have many gods. So they used to have many gods. They didn't used to believe in. They were neither Christians nor Jews. They weren't people of the book. Their role was just purely expansion. It wasn't a religious war or anything like that. The Mongols came with the aim of expansion, purely expansion. The Jews, the Christians, obviously they came with the religion. The Persians, they came with Zoroastrianism, etc. And obviously the Muslims had Islam. But the Mongols, their goal was not a religious goal. It was purely conquering.
Who signed off the Palestine to the Zionists?
Who signed it off?
Yeah.
So we'll be covering that next week, inshallah. As I said, because we want to cover all of the everything that's related to the establishment of the state of Israel, and then what happened after that. I want to try and cover that all together, just so that we don't split it up. But 2nd of November is a famous date where the letter to Lord Rothschild was written, saying that he can have the land of Palestine, where the land of Palestine, in that letter, in a few words, basically was said to him that you have non-Jewish minorities in this land, whereas this land was basically belonging 98% or 97% Muslim and Palestinian, and the Jews were only about 3% at that time. As we said, remember, we said only 2.3% of the Jews went. 55,000 landed, took refuge in Palestine from the Russians and Poland. So the number was not that large, and they were still in the UK. Lord Rothschild was in the UK, when that letter was signed over on the 2nd of November.
The reason why you've got Palestine on this side, and then you've got land in the middle, and you've got a little slither of land, it's Gaza, right?
Yeah.
Why is it not like one part?
So
Why is it in two sections? Because that way, you divide, you're definitely saying what you're saying, is divide and rule, right? Because now what they're saying is, instead of saying Palestinians, they're calling everybody Hamas, right? Sorry about the language, I'm not trying to scare anybody out here. But the thing is, and they call everybody, including a 3-year-old child, is a Hamas, right? So it's okay to kill a 3-year-old child because the whole thing is now Hamas. It's not a Palestinian issue anymore. It's a Hamas issue. You know what I mean? So what they're doing is they're separating the Palestinians from the west, from that section, from the Jerusalem side, and then the small slither of land where there's about 2.5 million, 2.3 million people, and now they're calling them Hamas civilians.
Yeah, militants, terrorists. So the question is that now we have the separation of West Bank and Gaza. We will cover that with the establishment of the State of Israel because this separation never existed before. Yeah. So next week we'll cover that in detail because that came. We've reached 1908. That happened in 1947. So we'll cover that next week, inshallah ta'ala. So that's just a very recent thing that took place. Yeah, there's part of divide and rule in there. But
in all the history, is there any political impact of Jewish till 1908?
Yeah, so last week we covered, so we have Dawood alayhi salam. So Dawood alayhi salam is from Banu Israel. So we have Dawood alayhi salam, Sulaiman alayhi salam. Dawood alayhi salam rules 40 years, Sulaiman alayhi salam rules for 40 years. Thereafter you have 10 years, the children of Sulaiman alayhi salam. And thereafter they split up and they have a civil war and they split into 12 different groups. 10 groups go towards the north. They're in the north of what is Palestine, but towards the Lebanon border, north of Jerusalem. So their capital is different. And then you have the state of Judea, which is in the south, where their capital is Jerusalem. All of this lasted for approximately 426 years. But again, it was not as one. The full state or the kingdom that was ruled by Dawood alayhi salam, Sulaiman alayhi salam, and his son lasted 90 years. After that, it got split up into 2 kingdoms. One lasted, we said last week, about 224 years, the other one 100 years more than that, and then it all collapsed. So that was basically the only period where the Jews had rule inside, political rule inside Jerusalem. Apart from that, they were only residents and being either having freedom or being oppressed. Any other questions? No question? Okay, inshallah. Jazakumullahu khairan.
You mentioned about Friends of Masjid Aqsa.
Friends of Al-Aqsa.
There's a meeting tomorrow, is it?
So, just a couple of announcements. I think tomorrow is obviously there will be a march in London. They've closed the tubes next week. Don't know why, but anyway, there's a march in London tomorrow. There's also a demonstration in Leicester on Sunday outside the town hall. On Sunday, there's also a program, I think, in Jamia Mosque with regards to the situation in Palestine. And Brother Ismail Adam of Friends of Al-Aqsa will be speaking there, inshallah ta'ala. And obviously he's been working in this field for decades and he has a much greater insight and a lot of insight into this, inshallah ta'ala. So participate and show your support for our brothers and sisters. Carry on doing all of the actions that you are doing, from participating in protesting, boycotting, etc. And obviously making dua for our brothers and sisters, donating as much as you can from your wealth to assist our brothers and sisters there. There are charities who are working on the ground. Give your money to them to assist our brothers and sisters, and continue to make dua that Allah Azza wa Jal makes things easier for them. Allah Azza wa Jal alleviates their suffering, removes the oppression, removes the oppressors, grants our brothers and sisters victory, and Allah Azza wa Jal returns Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa and the land of Palestine to Islam and the Muslims, and everyone can live in peace and justice just as they were living previously.
Now, one other thing is that if anybody goes to London, please do not put any money in the buckets. There are a lot of con merchants out there with red buckets and saying they were collecting Palestinians, but they're not collecting Palestinians. The money going in their back pocket. So if you have to give money, give it to the proper organizations like the masjid that we pray our salats in, or give it to a responsible organization that's going to be looking after the money. Because a lot of people are conning, people in